Question. You are talking about a path, but some non-dual teachers deny that there is a path, or they say there's nothing to be done to attain enlightenment. What would you say to that? Well, what they say is both valid and not valid. It needs to be understood in a larger context. So let's look at the world we grew up in. We have been inundated with technology. And technology is basically mechanical. If you push this little switch on the wall, the light comes on. And if the light doesn't come on, there's something wrong. And if you fix what's wrong, then the light is going to work again. So this is what we have grown up with. And we have, especially in the Western world, we have sort of been programmed to think that everything in life can be approached this way as if it's a mechanical thing. So certainly I have met people on the spiritual path who, when they heard about the concept of the spiritual path, they thought it was like that. It was mechanical. In other words, you tell me what the goal is, you tell me, give me a method for reaching that goal, and then they expect that after a certain time they're going to reach that goal. In my first spiritual movement, the goal was a higher state of consciousness, different stages of it, but the first one was cosmic consciousness. And the method for getting there was to meditate. And in the early days, it was actually promised that if you meditated every day, then after 8 years you would reach cosmic consciousness. And that was, of course, after 8 years had gone and some people had meditated every day, they realized, well, they hadn't reached cosmic consciousness, so what had gone wrong? But, and so I'm in total agreement with the fact that the spiritual path is not a mechanical process. You cannot create, let's say you want to create a mystery school. So you're creating some kind of retreat center. And the idea is that people come in, they pay for a course, and after, say, however long, 6 months, a year, they're supposed to be enlightened. That cannot be done. I mean, it absolutely can't be done. You cannot force awakening or enlightenment. However, that doesn't mean you can't do something to approach it. You just can't force it. You can't reduce it to a mechanical process. It will always be sort of a creative process. And what do I mean with a creative process? I mean that it's that you come to see something. And again, this is a tricky concept because what have we been programmed with in the modern world? We have been programmed that we go to school, we pay attention, we do our homework, and at some point we are going to go to an exam and then we're going to graduate. And then we can go out and apply for a job. And it's again this idea of the mechanizing everything. You can say that, yes, you can put somebody through a certain program and they learn certain things so they can get a degree as an engineer, but does that really mean that they become a good engineer? Does that mean that they have an intuitive feel for how to do things, how things work? So we have been, we've been programmed to think that if you find a spiritual teaching that comes from a higher source or some kind of higher authority, and if you study it and come to understand it intellectually, then that should be enough to, once you understand enough about the spiritual path, it's going to click and you're going to be enlightened. Again, that can't happen either. You can't set up a program of spiritual exercises that is automatically going to bring you to enlightenment. I totally agree with that. Because when it comes to it, we have certain illusions that are keeping us from enlightenment. And we have to come to see that it's an illusion. And that, as I said, is not a matter of just accumulating knowledge. It's a matter of stepping back and seeing it. And so, in the way I explain the spiritual path in my videos, I have a simple way to explain this. And what I'm saying is very simply, we have a higher self in the spiritual realm. The higher self decided it wanted to experience what it was like to be an embodiment on a planet like Earth. And so the higher self can't descend. I've explained this in my How the World Was Created video, so I don't want to go into too much of it here. But the higher self can't descend in its fullness, so it sends an extension of itself, which is what I call the conscious you. And this conscious you is neutral. It doesn't have any value judgments, any likes or dislikes, any this should happen, that shouldn't happen. It doesn't have any of this evaluation. It's just neutral. It's just observing. It's kind of like you can say that it's just looking without having any colored glasses in front of your eyes. That's how the conscious you is. It doesn't judge anything. But in order to descend into embodiment and actually come to see yourself as a human being, and accept, think that this is the real world we're in, you have to take on a certain number of illusions. And so you descend to what I've called the 48th level of consciousness out of 144. There are 144 levels of consciousness, and you descend to the 48th level in order to take embodiment for the first time. And then you have, at the 48th level, you have a sense that you are connected to your higher self. And you can either go up and expand that sense of connection, or you can go below the 48th level, go into what I call separation, where you use the duality consciousness to create the illusion that you are a separate self. And these illusions that you create are based on a duality consciousness that always has two opposite polarities. And so what we can say here is that because the earth is as dense as it is, we are in a sense, the conscious you is starting at a sense of oneness with your higher self, but by taking on these delusions, you are forcing yourself out of oneness. And then when you go into separation and duality, you are creating a whole different level of force where you now have the two dualistic polarities where you say one is right, one is wrong, one is good, one is bad. So that's why you can't force your way back to enlightenment or back to oneness with your higher self. You can't force it because it was force that brought you out of oneness. You can't force yourself back into oneness. The more force you apply, the further you go into separation. So I agree with that. You cannot force enlightenment or awakening. But that doesn't mean that the only alternative is to sit around and wait for it to happen spontaneously, as some of these non-dual teachers seem to apply or imply that it just either happens or it doesn't happen. So what can you do? You can just sit around and listen to these teachers and hope that one day it's going to click. And what I'm saying is, I'm not the only one who talks about a spiritual path, right? This has been talked about for thousands of years. It's a concept that's very, very old. So why have so many people talked about it? Well, because there's something to it, And so if you have these non-dual teachers in the modern world who are using the modern linear mindset to reason that if you can't force enlightenment, there's nothing you can do to attain it, then they are denying this entire tradition based on so many people's experiences. So what you have to realize is that the spiritual path, first of all, is not mechanical. It's not guaranteed. You can't force it. You can't force your way to results. But what you can do is you can overcome these illusions that forced you away from oneness. And it's not just, as I explain in many of my videos, it's not just that there's an illusion. There's actually a self that you create. Because you're creating a certain matrix out of the illusion, but you are feeding energy into it. And this means that you're creating a self that it doesn't have self-awareness or sophisticated consciousness, but it has enough of a consciousness to pull on the conscious you, so that it tries to make the conscious you think that this is how it is. This is how the world works. This is how I am, as the separate self sees it. I really am a separate being, and so forth and so on. So you could say that the illusion we need to overcome in order to reach enlightenment is that we are a separate being. But there are many of these illusions that reinforce that impression that we are separate. And that's why what we need to do, we can't overcome this all at once. I mean, if we did, we would go into an identity crisis. We wouldn't know who we were. You would end up in a straitjacket. I've seen this happen to people. So, so that's why from ancient times, they have talked about, spiritual teachers have talked about a gradual path. And the way I describe it is that you're starting at a certain level. And at this level, where you hear about the concept of a spiritual path, you have a certain amount of these subconscious selves, separate selves. And so what you do is you start using a spiritual teaching, using spiritual techniques to work on the particular self that corresponds to your present level of consciousness on this ladder of the 144. So let's say that you're at the 48th level and you hear about the concept of spiritual path. So there's a particular illusion at the 48th level that keeps you at that level. And when you overcome that illusion, when you see through that illusion, you rise to the 47th. But is it just a matter of spontaneously waiting for this epiphany? No. You can study spiritual teachings, you can look at your own reactions, you can look at psychology, and you can practice a spiritual technique for transforming the energy that's accumulated in this self. It's the energy that pulls on the conscious you. When you transform the energy back into a higher vibration, there's less of a pull on the conscious you, which means all of a sudden the conscious you can now step outside the self, look at it from the outside, realize that I have created the self, but I haven't become the self. And the self gives me a certain experience, but I really don't want that experience anymore. I want a higher experience. So instead of trying to solve any problem or do anything about the self or destroy the self, I just let it die. I just let it go. I walk away from it. That's what you can do. And that's basically the process you could continue all the way up to the 144th level, coming to see through the illusion, dissolving the energy, just letting the self go. And of course, you can come to a point where you have become so aware of this process that it becomes much easier for you. And you can also come to a point where you have less and less identification with these outer selves, especially these dualistic selves. I mean, you can come to a point where you've overcome the dualistic selves, the separate selves. You don't see yourself as a separate being. And that's what some people call awakening. That's what some people call enlightenment. But I don't consider it that way because I don't, as I've said in some of my other videos, I don't think we reach the ultimate level of consciousness while we are embodiment on earth. It's just not possible. I don't care what you project that this teacher or that teacher was enlightened. If we are in a physical body, we have not reached an ultimate level of consciousness, because if we did, we couldn't hold on to a body. We would ascend. So you can say, when they say there is no path that leads to enlightenment, in a sense they are right if you look at the path as this outer mechanical process. But if they say there's nothing you can do to move closer to enlightenment, I strongly disagree with that. There is definitely something you can do, or perhaps something you can undo, because it isn't really a matter of doing as a separate self, it's a matter of undoing the illusion of the separate self. Now this is a process, and it can be approached as a step-by-step path that leads you to see through one illusion, the next, and so forth. And I see it as something ongoing. Obviously, you can come to a point where you don't have so many illusions left, but still, it's not a final stage, because there just is no final stage on earth. And if you think that you have reached some final stage, what does that mean? It means that now you're no longer open to looking at yourself. So how are you going to overcome the illusions you have left? I mean, even if you only have one illusion left, if you're not open to looking for that illusion, how are you going to overcome it? Actually, so just to sum it up, why does this idea that there's no path to follow, why does this appeal to some people? And I have in some of my other videos talked about this idea of the outer path, the automatic path. And the outer path basically says you can follow this outer procedure and it will qualify you for salvation or enlightenment without you having to look at yourself. Even Jesus said, look at the beam in your own eye. And for me, that means look at your own psychology, look at your reactions, realize that your reactions come from these subconscious selves. You look for the self, you look for the illusion, and you let it go. But this, of course, requires your willingness to look at yourself. And many people find the spiritual path, but they still have a reluctance to look at themselves. I mean, I had it for at least 20 years. The first 20 years I was on the path, it was not totally close to looking at myself, but I was very reluctant because I felt that if I discovered something in my psychology that was really bad, I would feel very guilty about it. I would condemn myself for it. This, of course, is a separate self that makes you feel that way. But as long as you have that separate self, it is more difficult to look at yourself. So that's why a lot of people, you come across the idea that there's a spiritual path. But what actually happens to many people is when you first hear about the spiritual path, you hear about more than one guru, more than one organization, more than one teaching. And it's often that one of them presents this outer path and another one presents a more inner path, a more difficult path, where you need to look at yourself and work on yourself. So the question is, what are people going to choose? Are they going to choose that outer path? Because what the outer path promises you basically is that you can reach enlightenment or nirvana or salvation without looking at your own psychology. And I'm not saying that this is a completely false or wrong approach, because you can make some progress with this. It's just that it will only take you to a certain point, because there comes a point where if you're going to go further on the path, you have to look at yourself. You have to look at your own psychology and be willing to deal with it. So basically what I see is that many of these teachers that are promising this, they attract people who are not yet ready to deal with their own psychology, to look at their own psychology. And maybe people need to be there for a while to have that experience. I'm not trying to judge people's individual path, but I'm just saying there comes a point where you have to realize that unless you get down and dirty and look into your own psychology and really look for these illusions, these reactionary patterns, you're not going to make it beyond a certain point on the path. You can make yourself think that you are very spiritual. And I've seen this happen to people, you find a spiritual movement, you go into this state of believing that if you are just faithful to this movement, this teaching, this guru, and if you continue to practice this practice, you will eventually make it. And then you have some people who now they've been doing this for 10, 20, 30 years. And now they have so much invested in this that they just can't admit to themselves that it's not working, that I'm not growing anymore, that I was growing in the beginning, but now I've stagnated. And maybe for the past 10, 15 years, it's just been more of the same. I haven't really grown. So they're actually at a point where they need another teaching, but they can't acknowledge this consciously because they have too much invested in that, following that teaching. And that's, of course, what can I say? I mean, they just stagnate. So what? What's that to me? I don't have any, saying this is wrong, they shouldn't be doing it. It's their path. But I'm just saying there comes that point, and I'm obviously not the only one who's realized this. Many people realize this, where if you don't look at yourself, you cannot go beyond that level of the path. And it doesn't matter how spiritual you feel, how spiritual your guru makes you feel, how special your guru makes you feel because you are following this guru, you are loyal to this guru, even though you're not growing. And what I'm saying is, don't be loyal to an outer guru, an outer organization, or an outer teacher, including me, Be loyal to your own inner path, your own inner process. That is what matters to you. So you have to be willing then to recognize that this outer path, or even denying that there is a path and saying you can spontaneously awaken, it's bypassing the work that has to be done. It's bypassing the mechanics of how we transcend our sense of self, our level of consciousness. And there are some very good videos out there about this, where some of them talk about spiritual bypassing in connection with non-duality and the concept of no self. And so this is what I would say. You always have to be aware that your subconscious selves, which many people call the ego, they always want to stop your growth. They would prefer you didn't find the spiritual movement and find the spiritual path. But if they can't stop you from that, if the ego can't stop you from that, it will want you to go to a certain point where you feel, now I must be spiritual because I'm doing all these outer things and I'm following this enlightened guru and this and that. And then it wants you to stay there, stop there, get comfortable there, so you're not growing. And it's possible that you can find a spiritual path and you can follow it for 30 years and you're not really growing. So you always need to be aware of that. And you need to be aware that there is no shortcut on the spiritual path. You have to look at the beam in your own eye. And if you are reluctant to do this, it's because, as I've said, you have a subconscious self that projects at you that either you have to be perfect, or you have to never make a mistake, or there couldn't be anything really wrong with you. And then you have another subconscious self that projects that if you are not living up to that, you are really, really bad, and you need to condemn yourself and feel really bad about yourself. And they're just selves. They're just projecting this at you. It's completely unreal. But if you are willing to look at this, you can come to see the selves. You can come to experience yourself as the pure awareness that the conscious you is, and realize, I'm not those selves. They're just selves. They're just selves. It's just like an overcoat I took on. I haven't become the overcoat. I can take it off, hang it on the hook, and just walk on out in the sun. And if you deny that, if you deny that there's a path, to me, you are putting up an impossible goal for people. As I've said before, you're saying, come up here to this elevated place where I am. But you're not providing them a step-by-step staircase to get there. You're saying, just jump. It will happen spontaneously. Just jump. Can't be done. I'm not denying that some people can have what they call a spontaneous awakening, but in my view it's because they have worked on it in past lifetimes and reached that point where they just needed that final breakthrough, and then that happens. But I've also seen spiritual people who thought they were awakened or enlightened, but it was just that they had an experience of the conscious you stepping outside of all the separate selves. And if they think, oh, this is some final, I've reached now the highest state of consciousness possible, then as I said, you're not going to look at the other selves and you're not going to make progress beyond that point. And so you are just sitting there. You may be teaching based on your own experience, but your experience isn't particularly helpful to other people, and it's not actually helpful to you because you're not growing either. And so what unfortunately happens in some spiritual movements is that you have a teacher who makes a claim, and they have some people who believe it, and now they are reinforcing each other. They are patting each other on the back, so to speak. And none of them are growing from it. In fact, it's a blind alley. So this is what you want to be aware of. You want to look at this and say, what am I really loyal to? I'm loyal to my own process of growth, not some outer teacher, not some outer teaching organization.